a former Chinese soldier who served with the Russian army in Ukraine has taken to Chinese social media and is trashing the Russian command and their style of fighting. But just what exactly did this PLA soldier experience, and why did it leave him so outraged? We're going to be taking a look at it and breaking it all down. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's go. So this is, again, a PLA soldier who was discharged or left the service. I don't actually know the circumstances that he left the PLA, but he enlisted in as a foreign fighter with the Russian army and is now talking about his experiences. Supposedly he enlisted in December, so it's now May, so he has 4 or 5 months of combat experience. All right, well, he's obviously opening. After returning, I ate a lot of butter and other things to help my digestive system. An aside by nothing, guys, eating a very high-fat diet, not necessarily great for your digestive health. Fiber, that's what you want, man. Fruits and vegetables. It's not really the takes you're here for, I understand. But listen, clearly he thinks it's really important to put this out to his audience, and so I guess I have to comment on it.
就是润滑那个肠胃的，但是还是大出血，十几天，从出发前，到回来以后。
Okay, this is actually kind of funny. I guess what he's describing is that the food quality is so poor that it caused constipation, right? And I'm going to try to skip ahead a little bit here so we don't have to listen to this. But this is actually a pretty common problem historically for a lot of soldiers. In fact, dysentery, right, which I guess is the opposite problem, was a really common killer of soldiers in antiquity, right, up until about the Industrial Revolution. Once we figured out germ theory and we figured out what dysentery was, we said, listen, we got to find ways to make food safer for soldiers to eat and prevent the spread of germs among a population of soldiers. And so there became a lot of sanitation, and there became changes to the rations that soldiers would eat. But things like canning, things like preserved meats and other kinds of like tacky, unleavened bread, anything that could be shelf stable for a long time, suddenly became much more normal. In World War II, you also saw mobile kitchens where, for example, the army would have a train of, let's say, cattle that would actually follow it, along with basically kitchen trailers, kitchens on wheels with big ovens where they could bake bread and cook massive amounts of meat. So they would sit there and go, okay, we need to feed a whole brigade today. Okay, we're going to slaughter these calves right here, or slaughter these cattle right here, and butcher them, put them in a pot, cook them down, right? Season it, add some cooking oil, add some whatever vegetables we can get our hands on, and push it out to the troops along with some bread that we baked. Very common stuff. And while it reduced dysentery, you might notice what doesn't feature in that diet is any kind of fiber, like anything that's going to facilitate, swift transit through the bowel. And actually, I have a hypothesis that MREs are designed to not do that. The U.S. military's MREs are actually designed to be very easy to digest, much like hospital food. Hospital food also is carefully calibrated because, remember, a lot of people go in the hospital, and if they have like an abdominal surgery, they need to eat food that's going to pass easily through the digestive system. It's one of those things that's kind of weird to talk about. And in fact, it's kind of weird that I've spent the last 2 minutes telling you about it. But as this guy notes in the first 45 seconds of his video, it's one of those things you don't think about until it becomes a problem. And then it's all you think about.
2个战斗小组，实际上可以划分4个战斗小组，但是打巷战都是头一次。
Okay, so I think this is a reference, fighting in urban warfare as a veteran support force. What I think he's referencing here is possibly the Russian stratification of their military that we've seen, where where soldiers with significant experience and specialty, like a specialty grad or MLRS operator, a specialty artillery crew, specialty tank crew, they will fulfill a support role, and the attacking force will be a low-skill light infantry unit. Think like a Storm Z, like a convict unit. They will be the storming force, and the veteran support force. I think he may be referencing his role as a specialist. And I think that makes a little bit of sense. The Russian military probably recognizing that this guy is former PLA. They likely said, listen, if you have combat training and the government of Russia didn't have to pay for it, especially the PLA uses still a lot of Soviet design, like equipment within the Soviet design philosophy, they probably were like, yo, whatever you were doing, you're going to do more of it. Oh, you were a tank crew member in the PLA? Great. You're going to be a BMP crew member here in the special military operation.
老兵，新兵过去，我跟你说啊，那边的阵亡率啊，就是人进入战场到基本上你死8到10个小时，就是
Yeah, this is what we're exactly. So he's saying, I think he's saying new recruits are those low skill light infantry forces. Again, think Storm Z convict troops, very poorly trained conscripts from, super rural Russia. Those are the folks he's talking about with these 8 to 10 hour lifespans.
不是这么快，那边打了最少得有1个月。因为很多房间内都有尸体，我给大家发了那个视频，有些视频里面在房间那都是有尸体的。
Yeah, this is something else that so in the U.S. military, we're actually trained, especially as officers. They say, listen, if you take casualties, what you never want to do is put those casualties, one, in a place where they're visible to other troops who are moving to the front line, because it's really demoralizing to see living troops going to the battlefield and dead troops coming out. Also, what you'd never want to do is that what we were trained, again, as officers, is if you have casualties or KIA, do not put them with the living, right? Because oftentimes one of the biggest fears that wounded soldiers have is that they're going to be abandoned on the battlefield, right? Because you have to think that if you're wounded, you may not be able to get out of the combat zone very quickly. And one of your biggest fears is that if you're routed, right, troops may just leave you because you can't walk. You need to be carried in many cases. And so they'll sit there and go, man, I'm afraid if I get left here in this room full of corpses, that it's their way of saying, listen, you're abandoned and we're going to leave you here to die yourself.
The
Russians don't seem to do this, right?
地下室都有人，都有死人，都有牺牲了，双方都有。回来的是我，小黑，还有俄罗斯人，还有一个是尼泊尔人，他中了4个弹片。小黑大腿一个，胳膊一个，那个俄罗斯人是大腿一个，我是被那个炮弹然后炸到。
Yeah, so he's describing probably what sounds like fighting in a village, possibly somewhere like Klichiva, or I guess if it would have been in December, it might have been around Avdiivka. But when he talks about, the basements are full of dying troops, that's sort of the fear realized. I think a lot of troops are told to assault a position. The assault fails. They withdraw. They leave some of their wounded comrades. And the only place you can go in these villages, the only safe spot, is in the basements of these buildings, right? Because everything above it, we've seen the footage, is basically just totally flattened.
房子上，然后给半边身子给砸住了，给砸中了，你知道吧？上面穿着防弹衣还好，胳膊，然后左边胳膊应该是弹片插过去了。洗澡的时候他才发现。
You may think that he's like, how could you not notice you were hit? But in the surge of adrenaline that happens, especially if you've been like near an explosion, you may literally just not notice. You may just not notice at all that you've been hit until the adrenaline wears off. And again, by the time the adrenaline wears off, that especially if it's small, it may not even hurt.
巷战很残酷，跟我想象中巷战不一样，他妈的！第2个战斗小组战斗队啊投入了。 也死了好多，之前在老营有2个。
This is also interesting, right? How he talks about these units that he's in. He says, okay, well, there was guys from India. I wonder if they are Indians or if they're Bangladeshi. He gives a location. Okay, Ponderp. Let's see if that is in India. Ponderp town, India. Ponderp region? Huh, weird. No, I can't find a Ponderp anywhere. Maybe it's some kind of mispronunciation.
个
Weird.
庞德普人也是印度人，他们去做支援，到现在留的是其他的部队，一直没有回来。他们给我发信息了，他们人还在。
This is the other thing that's been fascinating about this war is that one of the things that, like, the U.S. military is just really did a lot of hand-wringing about is cell phones on the battlefield. How do we communicate securely? How do we stop cell phones from being triangulated? And lo and behold, it turns out that if you have just a ton of people on the battlefield, the cell phones, you can just go nuts, right? These guys, again, messaging each other on Telegram, on WhatsApp. I've even seen some Ukrainian command centers that are using Discord to do screen share.
卢卡如果治疗了好的话，他腿不用截肢；治疗了不好，腿得截肢。小黑，我从马尾掉到这儿，我都没给他说一句话，是因为有一天晚上执行任务，有2个老毛子，还有我小黑，我们组成了一个4人战斗小组，像一个防。
Yeah, this is the other thing that's kind of weird is, like, because of the high fatality rate, the high casualty rate, it seems like they have to form a lot of these impromptu teams where instead of having a trained reconnaissance unit, or even groups of people who are trained in reconnaissance who can coordinate together, they just kind of get hey-you'd into roles. And to be clear, that happens, like, we did that all the time when we were in Afghanistan, right? We're just like, hey, listen, I need 4 soldiers to do task X or task Y. And it was just considered, hey, this is a kind of job that anybody should be able to do. But again, it's kind of weird, like, having people conduct reconnaissance, because we've seen, for example, Ukrainians rely on drones to do a lot of their reconnaissance.
房子那边侦察，然后如果有敌人的话就打，在半路的话，然后遇到
Yeah, sending 4 people though, this is also worth bearing in mind. 4 people is not a large enough element that you should tell them to engage at all. The reason I say that is because the general rule is that if you're the attacker, you want to outnumber your enemy 4-1. So if you have 4 or 3-1, so if you have 4 people, the only kind of force you can expect to engage and win with is a 1-person element. If you run into 1 lone person. So having this 4-man team conduct reconnaissance is kind of a waste of time. It's not a waste of time. Giving a 4-man team instructions to engage with an element if they see it is kind of a waste. Now, it's not a waste if they are the lead element, right? What you can do is say, listen, you are going to go out and you're going to establish contact with the enemy, right? If you get shot, you return fire. But then the plan has to be to reinforce that fire team with an element large enough to win the fight, and or deliver larger strikes like artillery strikes or MLRS or grads or glide bombs onto that target. That might be what it's trying to do. It's called sometimes a recon by fire, or in Vietnam, it was called search and destroy, right? Where you would have an element go out screening, looking for an enemy. They would establish contact, and then they would fight, but not try to actually defeat the enemy. They would just try to pin them in place long enough for U.S. heavy firepower to be brought to bear.
无人机，侦察无人机带来了是炮弹。那个是叫 B 奇卡，然后是他这边称之为那个
I was going to say, reconnaissance drones with bombs are attack drones.
攻击无人机啊，就是投弹无人机也好，还有自杀无人机也好，它较为就是说是嘎米嘎兹，
Gamagazi. Which is funny. It's, this is just, I mean, this is like linguistic globalization, right? The Russians call it Gamagazi, but he may not realize that he's referring to kamikaze, which is, of course, the Japanese word for, like one-way mission, it means like divine wind or something in Japanese, but it became the term for a one-way aircraft mission in World War II. And then it became just a general descriptor for a weapon system that goes out, hits its target, but does not expect a return, right? An attack mission that has no return plan. And so now the Chinese guy is like, it's got this thing, kamikaze.
发音，它是有2种那种攻击方式。我们被无人机炸，还被对方。
So he's describing being hit by, so they're all drones, I think. He's saying that there's overhead drones, which we've seen, the ones that position themselves overhead and drop ordnance, and then there's the FPV drones that actually come in at ground level and assault at a horizontal trajectory.
然后近距离我挨了一炮，他这边的用的炮弹威力小，有迫击炮弹是威力小，有一种啊是波兰的，它跟那个这边的那个迫击炮弹发的声音是不一样的。以前呢，其他的国家的一些迫击炮弹，它发声音的时候。弹体啊，放到那个迫击炮筒里面 boom.
I'm very curious about why he describes the mortars as weak, right? And what makes me curious is that, we know that these drones, while very effective and precise, they have a limit to the weight that they can carry, meaning that there's kind of a cap on how large of an explosive charge these drones can really bring to bear. And again, precision offsets the low yield of the munition. But why he thinks the mortars are weaker when they should all be NATO standard, right? 60 or 120 millimeter mortars. And that he may be thinking, he may have seen in the PLA only 120 millimeter mortars, and therefore seeing a 60 millimeter mortar feels underpowered.
爆炸，然后啾，爆炸是一个声音，啾是第二个声音，然后落地 boom 爆炸是第3个声音。但是波兰那个迫击炮啊
Oh, no, he's talking about artillery rounds, 155s. Okay, I wonder why he calls them weak. Yeah, I'm even more curious now. I wonder if it's a reference to maybe he means weak in the sense that when he was there, the Ukrainians would have been very conservative, literally conserving a lot of their munitions. Remember, December, January, February, March was the time when Ukraine was running out of munitions and the U.S. had not yet approved additional aid. So their fire missions would actually be very anemic, right? They would say, okay, we're going to have to use about 1/10 of what we normally would. And so it may be like the shells themselves are powerful, but it may be like the volleys they were launching were underpowered relative to what the Russians were sending. That sort of makes sense.
它发射是没有声音，在空中飞行的时候啊，它也是没有声音的。你必须仔细去听，因为这边是平原，风特别大。你仔细听的话，顺着风听，你会听到呲呲呲，就这种声音。所以说非常非常危险。那天晚上打那一仗，小黑他也是胆小，他以前没有当过兵，之前在装甲部队的时候，他也是打酱油。
Interesting. Again, so it sounds like having no military experience, he should have been I'm not sure what this means. When he was in the armored unit, he was just along for the ride. I wonder if that means that he didn't know what he was doing, but was still serving in an armored unit, or if he literally means that he was being carried to the battlefield in an infantry fighting vehicle or an armored personnel carrier, right? Something where he was like light infantry being brought to the battlefield. We've seen footage of this sort of thing before.
去小树林其他地方做支援，他也没有主动报名去。所以说这打这个巷战他害怕我能理解，他跑了，2个俄罗斯人也跑了，我不怪他们，这没啥可怪的。 所以说是在战场上啊，不要相信任何人，包括你的队友。我说是在国外啊，在国内那不存在，因为咱中国的那个军人呢，那真是生死。
Yeah, this is funny because, again, what's worth noting is that, in the U.S. military, I say the same thing. Like, that's just not something that U.S. military soldiers do. But you have to remember the Russian military may have been like this, but because of the extremely high casualties they've had for 2 years, as the Russians themselves, some of their propagandists have started to admit, Russia, as they say, is on its third army, right? There was the first army that went into Ukraine. Those are the highly trained active duty Russian soldiers. And they probably didn't run from the fight, but they received, by some analysis, around 90% casualties, right? So 90% of them are no longer in the battlefield in any capacity. And they've been replaced by then a reserve army, an army of, reservists or kind of backline troops or troops in kind of administrative positions, right? Troops who were fulfilling other duties but had completed their training. Those troops got brought in, and then they suffered a comparable level of attrition over the next year. So now Russia is relying on this army of conscripts. There's a few, there's a skeleton staff who are in command of these units, who have command levels of experience. But by and large, tank crew members, light infantry crews, mortar crews, artillery crews, these are all soldiers who have, in the aggregate, they're the third line, so to speak, of Russian military forces. And you can imagine if the U.S. military was to have comparable levels of casualties, right? You had every actual trained soldier getting wiped out. Then you had every reserve soldier, everyone with military training or just like a sense of patriotism and duty get wiped out. Now, who are you left recruiting, right? Again, prisoners, people with substance use issues, people who couldn't finish their schooling, people from extremely poor environments where, a couple $1,000s a month seems like might as well be $100 million where they come from. So, this is the comparable strategy, right? Imagine if you were to sit there and be like, okay, the U.S. military is now fighting with, paying just untrained individuals from foreign countries to do some of the fighting. You would be like, okay, this is, I don't expect that much of this military force.
死兄弟，如果真发生战争，他们肯定会救你，甚至愿意付出自己的生命来救你。但是在国外，你只能靠自己，你靠别人，他妈的靠不住。我跟你说，兄弟们，还好那天晚上我活着回来了，我找了一个废弃的还没有敌人的，后来慢慢又汇合在一起。小黑一直想道歉，我一直没理他那么多。这次我调到这个马尾这个地方，当时他应该是去干别的事情了。马尾说需不需要跟他们道别，我说不需要，有什么好道别的。古巴在装病，他一直说他有心脏病，小树林的战斗也没去。
Yeah, interesting too. I wonder if this is like some sort of foreign detachment. I know Russia has some of those, but my understanding was that the foreign detachments were of volunteers. And I guess these guys are also technically volunteers. But you hear, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Cubans, just about anybody who's willing to sign up to fight in exchange for a European passport is willing to get flown out here for and by Russia.
没做支援，巷战他也没打。之前这装甲部队，然后就是在2线、3线，2线都没有，3线做支援，打酱油。
Right, and that's what I think is also interesting, right? This 3-line system that Russia seems to have is really interesting to me, where, and it doesn't look like there's any kind of rotation system. I've heard some other stories that have alluded to Russia doing like they pay you more as you get closer to the front line. Some soldiers are promised that they'll be third-line soldiers, but in fact they end up as front-line soldiers. Again, I suspect that maybe there's the first line, which is the Stormzy light infantry direct combat units. The second line may be specialty units, drone operators, mortar artillery units, and then third line being like kind of reserve or logistics units, truck drivers, people hauling food to and from, trench diggers, individuals who have like non-combat roles, right? Like truly are not involved in combat operations in any kind of direct way. That's kind of what but it's a hypothesis that that's what the first, second, and third line refer to in the Russian military. But they may literally refer to, because we know the Russians do a defense in depth, they may actually be talking about 3 lines of trenches.
就是其他的我也不知道说啥。对，从出发前，小黑做了一次饭，炖牛肉吃了列巴，到那儿然后得到了一次补给，有时候是得到了一次补给，吃了一顿饭，后来吃了3次罐头，再剩下的就没吃过其他东西了。3次罐头有一次我记得清楚是吃的是2罐，一罐牛肉罐头，一罐鸡肉罐头。但是黄油我逮着机会我都吃。
This is actually really interesting to me because if you've ever had the Russian rations, their military rations, they have a really interesting sort of you know how a can, like if you buy like a can of soup in the United States, it's a pretty heavy aluminum can, right? You could even reuse it and put other stuff in it. You shouldn't because the liners are kind of weird, but in the Russian military, what they actually use is like, imagine foil packs. They actually can like pâtés in foil packs. Think like a soft Spam. It's really interesting, and basically they use crackers as kind of their carbohydrate for the whole meal. So you just put shit on crackers. Is the idea. But again, that was the active duty Russian military's rations. It's hard to know what exactly these talk about now about canned food. When I never saw in the tours of the Russian, the tours of like Russian barracks and stuff or Russian fighting positions, I never saw components from the Russian IRP, the individual ration pack. Let's see, Russia. You used to be able to buy Russian rations on Amazon, but you could see here they're now gone, right? Probably because of the, what's what I want? Sanctions, right? In fact, the only one you can see here is actually Ukrainian Armed Forces ration, which is kind of annoying because, they need this to fight. But, it's probably just too tempting.
最少吃4块。我没想到这次打这么长时间，真的。以前他妈的最多打他妈1天1夜，去小树林也是，白天休息，你想干嘛干嘛，然后晚上推进，晚上打。在这儿是不分白天不分黑夜，就他妈干。而且他妈的对方的无人机。
Interesting. I wonder if if he's describing the Russian offensive, right? But there was the offensive in Avdiivka that he should have been a part of. Maybe it was just a unit assignment, and I don't know why he says fight at night, because as we know, I've never seen Russian troops operate with night vision en masse. They could be manning positions at night, going out into positions and occupying them, and then holding them until a relief shift. But this is really interesting that he says, okay, now we're fighting continuously. Which sort of tracks, right? We know Russia was preparing for a summer offensive and that they launched it early because they were really expecting U.S. aid to be further delayed, giving them time to bring their military up to full strength and Ukraine's military to become even more depleted. But that didn't happen, so they launched their summer offensive early, and they're likely trying to offset the lack of preparation with just a really unsustainably high op tempo.
这是真他妈的多，我估计你们没有见过那个对方无人机炸坦克。因为这边也有干扰，他妈的大老远都听见，妈的天上无人机比他妈鸟都多，我跟你说真的。 那他妈无人机哇，呜飞过来以后，前面都是一道。
That's interesting. We've heard this from other sources that there's increasingly they use the word like mothership or like queen drone, but it sounds like it's more like a relay, and that one drone becomes the observation drone and it relays signals to the other drones, the FPV drones. And I've never heard that they actually fly like that, but it would make sense, right? You could have one operator run, let's say, 5 or 6 FPV drones, one after the other. And we've seen that that's kind of the MO, is to sit there and go, okay, here's a Russian column of, let's say, 5 APCs. Then you say, okay, great, we're going to launch 10 FPV drones at this, and we're going to hit the lead column, hit the lead vehicle, hit the trail vehicle, and then as infantry soldiers like deploy out, then the FPV drones go and strike individual soldiers. So there's definitely an incentive to put a lot of FPVs on the battlefield at once, but I haven't actually heard this level of detail about like the like mothership, queen drone, drones. Queen drone. I'm trying to figure out what analogy to use here. If we're using a beehive analogy, you'd have the queen, but then everything under the queen would be a drone. A queen drone and a warrior drone, I guess. Maybe like a shooter spotter, right? But that's not really the relationship, right? This is more like command and subordinate.
2架，然后排头。你这边如果有干扰的话，你就干扰前面那2架，那后面的无人机，然后空。
Interesting. So if you have a signal jammer, he says, it only interferes with the 1 or 2 drones leading the pack. That tracks. So that, to me, says that these drones, these relays, must have some kind of command function, right? So maybe some kind of automatic control function must be housed in these lead drones, and then the FPV drones must be like receiving signal instructions from the main drone. And that would make sense, because that way you can send out one drone with a lot of compute power and no ordnance, and it can talk to 5 or 6 subordinate drones that don't have any sort of onboard brain to do any thinking on their own. But because the signal is local, maybe the jammers somehow are less effective. That sounds really interesting. I'd love to know more about it.
然后排头，你这边如果有干扰的话，你就干扰前面那2架，那后面的无人机，然后空，他妈的炸你周围，炸了你都不敢露头，谁都不敢露头。而且人家那边情报做得很好，这边刚他妈有一台那种就是说是那种坦克，然后进入战场，人家那边都发现了，然后就是说炸了你所有人不敢露头，然后后面有几架那种无人机带了那种就是说 C4 炸药。或者是带了是那种就是说是打坦克那种就是火箭炮那种弹头，就对着你那个坦克嘣一发啊，嘣一发，我操，最少2-3发。
Yeah, that again, like we've seen, that's absolutely it. There's we know that Ukraine relies on a shooter spotter. It also uses a shooter spotter strategy where there's an observation drone that observes main thoroughfares, right? Key avenues of approach. And then when it sees a Russian tank enter the battlefield or a Russian armored column, the FPV drones go and hit that, in this case, tank he's describing, but will often hit the lead vehicle of a convoy or the trail vehicle of a convoy, kind of locking them into place. And then often you'll see by that time a fire mission will get launched and artillery will take care of the rest.
打他妈的就是给你打成零件。你人往外跑，你跑个锤子，他妈炮塔他妈的蹦几十米外了，所以他妈的这他妈巷战跟我想象中不一样。我想象中的巷战就好像我看电影一样，我心想没事老远啪打完以后近距离人可手雷一踹门而入，没事看电影。
I'm surprised the PLA itself didn't disabuse this guy, but it's hard to know, right? It could have been the PLA. And that's the People's Liberation Army, the military of China. One is very broad, so he could have been in the PLA Air Force and never, done, loading ordnance onto aircraft. He could have even been a PLA infantryman, but never really trained on house-to-house fighting or urban combat or clearing. He could have even been somebody who just was like a cook in the PLA army. And sometimes there's even things like political officers who are in the PLA but aren't in the army.
入感嘛， 把以前看的电影那些动作没事做一遍，哎，感觉挺好，重在体验嘛，对吧？这边不一样，我操他娘的，真的是，那边也狠，这边也狠。说句那个难听点的啊，谁都不会留手。就是子弹最普通的子弹都换成穿甲弹，就是怕打不死你，就怕打不死。
So I don't know if this is true or not. One, like, yeah, you want your rounds to penetrate the body armor, and if everybody's got ballistic rated body armor, then you kind of have to.
死你，就怕打不死你，听懂没有？唉，再后来打的就是老部队人打完了，从其他部队抽调老兵过来，然后给你打配合，语言沟通不熟悉，打配合打不了。
Okay, wait. I'm trying to figure out what this means. They pull some veterans from other troops to support us after the veterans are finished, which means like so after I guess the more seasoned units are KIA.
打的就是老部队人打完了，从其
They
他
pull other seasoned troops from other units to support their attrited unit.
部队抽调老兵过来，然后给你打配合，语言沟通不熟悉，打配合打不了。那他妈死人，说句实话，那很快的，前2-3分钟还在那抽烟了干嘛了？突然之间接到通知了，然后向另外一个据点、一个房子，然后进攻，那说死就死了。对方的无人机也多，对方只要发现侦察无人机，他带来的是炮弹；发现自杀式无人机，他就是炸你。我比较幸运，没有遇到那种自杀式无人。
Okay, it's funny. I don't understand the difference between this and a kamikaze. Really interesting that he sees them as being distinct. But it is really one of the things that, I've talked about, that Ukraine is relying on this defense and depth strategy, and they want Russia to attack, right? Like Russia attacking is a core part of the Ukrainian strategy. As he describes, right? It's like he wants to be secure somewhere, but he continually gets orders to attack. And the Ukrainians say, literally, the Ukrainian strategy has just become, come at me, bro. Like, do it. And the idea is that they come up, and as he describes, he has to move across a house, across a building, exposing himself. The Ukrainians observe him, and then from a distance, they attack him. It's one of the things that we've seen in a lot of footage where Russian troops often won't see the Ukrainians at all, right? They'll have individual weapons, they'll have their assault rifles, but they'll never really reach the Ukrainian lines.
在房间里面遇到过，但是炸墙，大家也知道这边墙体非常厚。在医院的时候，我给大家拍过，墙体厚得很。哎呀他妈的！我跟你说啊，2层楼妈打成1层楼，就在里面打，就不敢离开地方。然后他妈打成1层楼，妈1层楼打成半层楼，然后他妈趴到那个水泥板底下。然后他妈对方的无人机在你头顶上飞，然后空空空空炸，我操他妈的，大型无人机，带那种他妈的迫击炮弹，然后白天那种他妈小的自杀式无人机。
Yeah, we've seen this where some of these drones, sometimes the Ukrainians will try to get through the windows with drones to get inside, because again, it's really dangerous to have an explosive go off inside a secured building because the shrapnel will ricochet often off of walls and other hard surfaces, and the individuals will have very few places to run inside. So while bombing the exterior, oftentimes it's just less effective. It can be effective with a large enough ordnance, but it's much more efficient to use these smaller drones and get them inside, which if you're like, man, this is like some Terminator level stuff. Yeah, this is like something out of Terminator. And this is why I talk that the era of drone warfare is going to be like pretty terrifying.
你对着窗口炸，妈的，你躲的吗？你真是，我跟你说，哎呀。他这边房子跟房子的距离都很远，然后最后我们撤回来的时候，跟其他的部队的老兵，然后打了2个据点，那2个据点旁边是个防风林，打那个据点，我跟你说是死了得有几10个人没打下来。 就是前后得有我待这10几天了，就是我知道了，包括我看到了，包括我主队我们进攻的啊，就那块地方我都攻了前后得有我待这10几天了，就是我知道了。
Yeah. Okay. So again, they're not offensives. They're like attacks. An offensive is like more of a strategic maneuver, right? It's something that goes on for weeks or months. But still, 3 attacks in 2 weeks, and no territory gained is pretty typical, right? If you've been on this channel, you know that's really common to see Russia launch hundreds of attacks and take just a few dozen square meters in a typical day.
包括我看到了，包括我主队我们进攻的啊，就那块地方我都攻了3次，3次我他妈的说句实话，最近的一次距离就是攻了，就是说100米。对方呢，我跟你说是有那个铁丝网，挖了有壕沟，然后我还布了有那个坦克地雷，还有其他地雷。你那会儿就不带想那是什么那个防步兵地雷了，因为对面的他妈的机枪，妈重机枪，还有他妈。
Right. This is one of the things we've talked about is that the use of obstacles in this war has really become essential. So you use this barbed wire, right, not only to slow the enemy's advance so that things like your machine guns and your drones can target them more effectively, but the mines do what's called canalize the enemy. And it doesn't take but a few mines in a field for the enemy to figure out, hey, listen, we can only drive tanks on this one road. We can only have troops go down this one road. And once you've done that, then you sit there and go, okay, well, now we don't have to worry about this whole big field. All we have to do is focus primarily on the road. And imagine if you can train your machine guns and your mortars and your artillery and your drones, and you know that there's like 2 routes that the enemy can possibly take because everything else you've mined. And you'll know if they try to clear the mines because it's a very slow process and your drones will see them.
妈的就是枪榴弹，还有后面的人家的就是说天上的妈的无人机，然后空空炸你，然后迫击炮空空炸你，我操他妈的，还有火箭筒，哎，你没法躲啊！我跟你说，那周围那路上，最粗的树啊，就还没我手腕粗。
We've talked about this, right? He's describing the exact Ukrainian strategy that we've talked about. Force the Russians to attack, force them to become exposed, and then just cripple them with fire. And like, yes, sometimes eventually the Ukrainians lose their position, but Ukraine's goal is to beat the Russians something like 10-1, right? Because, you know, Russia is bringing on about 30,000 new troops a month, which is a huge recruitment effort, but it doesn't have an infinite number of troops. And as he discusses, the quality of that trooper, of the median Russian soldier, is going down pretty precipitously. So all of that is part of the Ukrainian strategy to just attrit Russian forces to the point where there just aren't any more effective fighting forces, and to improve Ukraine's ratio, where they want to have seasoned troops on the front line, and Russia, they want to attrit them down so that they have fewer and fewer veteran troops who can actually fight well.
不好打，我都怀疑那一块啊。
He says bases. He means fortified positions, like a trench line.
那块儿，对方是搞了一个陷阱。这边就是说，我们打下这个房子，然后就是说是，如果对方的对讲机没有打坏的情况下，这边老毛子就拿着对方对讲机然后听。但是啊，人家那边就是立马就换频道了。我们这边也是。
This is the same. Actually, they change channels every hour. In the U.S. military, we have a frequency hopper, and a ComSec. Our frequencies automatically change. Our encryption is just us hopping very quickly through frequencies, and that is one of the sort of defenses, is that you'll make small frequency hops in a way that everyone in ComSec can get. As long as everyone has the current ComSec, communication security protocols, right? And those we updated in Afghanistan every single week. So every week, every communications device would get new ComSec loaded on it, and it would be a new sort of map, so to speak, a new sort of way to hop through all these little frequency changes. This is just a very simple version of that, to just click over your radio. But again, simple can work too. Right? You only need to be more sophisticated than your enemy, if that makes sense.
所有的频道1个小时一换。你就是如果你要是没有记住的情况下，我操，那完犊子了，你都跟上级失去联系了。还有一种情况就是老毛子死了，对讲机不是不会用，会用，但是这个语言沟通问题，你没办法，都是手机都是全信号屏蔽。还有就是说，你攻下这个房子以后啊，第一时间就是防守。
Right, this is really interesting. He's describing what I talked about, where Russia has a really refined set of tactics for going building to building.
你不防守，对方的迫击炮都已经把这个坐标给标好了。只要这个地方一失守，对方的无人机都开始过来，然后迫击炮弹、他妈榴弹炮开始空怼你。然后就是说是你在守据点的时候需要支援的时候，对方打了什么子母弹，在他妈空中爆炸，嘣，冒一股青烟，2秒钟，然后噼里啪啦噼里啪啦，我跟你说是方圆他妈的那一大片，我跟你说全部都是子母弹。这个我跟你说对装甲目标杀伤非常小。但是对人员杀伤是非常大的。
Yeah, this is just fascinating. He's really breaking down the Ukrainian defense in depth strategy. And, I'd be curious to know, like, what does it look like to fortify a building against this? Is it about blocking windows and doors, I imagine? Is it about putting sandbags and other sort of material around the walls? Is it about getting the roof or building like a roof under the roof, so to speak? I'd really love to know.
你不管打哪儿，你那会儿别想着什么防步兵地雷，根本就不会想那些说。你挨上就挨上了，踩上就踩上了，因为对面的敌人让你他妈的根本就没时间思考这个问题，你知道吧？那路上那躺的尸体多得很，盖白布了，有的是盖那种衣服的，那都是我们自己人。还有大家在讨论一个问题，说我们那个 Okay,
so I actually have to pause it here, and the reason is because he starts listening to the radio, and they're playing like a Tom Petty song or something, or a song by the Police, but it'll get copyright claimed. But he also just kind of shows some earlier footage. But I think this has been incredibly, incredibly interesting. If you want to see, right, I talked a lot about the different combat footage that's out there. If you want to see it and you want to support the channel, you guys know that not almost all, but many of my videos get demonetized by YouTube because they don't like war content, even if it's clearly informative and doesn't show any violence like this one. And of course, sponsors just have their own stances about war content, i.e. they don't want it. So I rely on you guys to support me. So if you want to become a member, any one of those tiers, it's going to get you access to the twice a week videos. And we're going to come up, we're thinking through, right? I shout out the lieutenant and the colonel tier folks at the end of every video, and we're coming up with something unique to them, a Q&A or something else. So sign up and we'll let you know. But honestly, if you want to support me, man, I'm so appreciative of everybody that does. Plus, again, we look at the viral combat footage, uncensored, coming out from the front lines. Usually it's less than 24 hours old, often less than, sometimes even less than like 12 hours old when we review it. So it's a really great insight into the front line itself. Anyway, thanks to all you members, Lieutenant tier and Colonel tier. Couldn't do it without you. See you in the next one. Cheers.